Hello and welcome to Sociology 101. As you can see, we have Seth Dillon back with us today from the Babylon Bee. Welcome back, Seth. I appreciate you being here.
Hey, great to be back.
And obviously, there to, I guess you're right, as Eric Hernandez, who you all know is our lead apologist for Texas Baptist. Welcome back, Eric. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Well, the reason we're doing this today is because we were caused by Phil Johnson to do this response. We had to do this response. I'm tongue in cheek, of course. What led to this was a back and forth that I was following along with, actually was engaged with what we mentioned earlier, with Phil Johnson kind of jumped in on it. Phil Johnson is the director of Grace to You Ministries there with John MacArthur that many of us know, and the What Ministries, led by Gabriel Hughes, had posted on their on Twitter some information about interaction. He says a person who believes the gospel believes it because of divine intervention. That's what I should say, divine intervention. And Seth, that's where I think you made a really good point here. You said, what do you mean when you say divine intervention? What non-divine process or chain of events is God intervening in? As a Calvinist, don't you maintain that all events, without exception, are divinely determined? Do you want to unpack that a little bit more about what you're trying to get to?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's useful to ask questions in situations like this rather than just, respond to directly to what's being said, because I want to understand if what they're saying is even intelligible, and I'm trying to determine whether or not it's intelligible. From the perspective of an account that is deterministic, to say that God intervenes in events that are unfolding in the world is to imply that there was a time at which he was not involved. He's hands off. And now he's hands on. He's getting in there to do something about it, to change the course of events, to fix something, to redirect something to go in a new direction. And that's even if you read further down here, I'm sure we'll get to it. There is some commentary to that effect where, he's intervening because man of his own devices was, never going to be saved. God has to come in and save him and change that. Well, the reason that man left to his own devices was not going to be saved is because that was the predetermined path for him, right? So there's a very real sense in which God is intervening with his own activity on this view. And I'm trying to make sense of that. What does that mean to interview with your own predetermined chain of events?
Yeah, it's well said. I mean, if you think of a computer programmer programming an avatar world to act exactly the way he has programmed it to act, then in what sense is that computer programmer intervening to change something that's happening in the world, except that he's intervening on that which he has programmed?
Well, and why does he need to intervene? If the whole thing has been predetermined from the beginning to have a certain outcome and all the pieces are lined up like dominoes to fall where they're supposed to fall, what sense does intervention make? What sense does a miracle make in that context? These are questions that I ask often, and I don't usually get direct responses. In this case, I did not get a direct response, and I had to keep pressing because, I would like to hear his answer to that question.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense maybe for a computer programmer to intervene into his predetermined world to an extent because he is not perfect, and so he may intervene to correct a mistake in his programming. But surely the Calvinist wouldn't want to say that God made a mistake in his eternal decree so as to intervene on that eternal decree, which is why you asked the question. Of course, he quotes a verse, I think, out of context, as we've already pointed out, back at you, and then you continue to press him. Again, what do you mean by divine intervention? What non-divine process or chain of events is God intervening in? And then this is where Phil Johnson comes in, and this is why we're saying Phil Johnson caused this response based upon his definition of cause that we'll look at later here in his article. But Phil Johnson caused us to do this by intervening here, and he says we say God intervenes when he overrules the normal effects of second causes. Okay, now Eric is trained more so in philosophy than I am, and so Eric, maybe you can decipher what you think Phil means by that statement. He says we say God intervenes when he overrules the normal effects of second causes.
Yeah,
do you have any idea what that means?
Yeah, so he's differentiating between what we would call a first cause and then secondary causes. So if I were to, and of course the main responsibility here is going to rely on the first cause. So I've often used the analogy, if I say tonight, before I go to bed, I set my coffee pot to brew at 5 a.m. When it starts brewing the next day at 5 a.m., I may still be asleep, but it starts to brew, and it's done via a secondary cause of the programming that I've put into the machine. Now, who's responsible for the coffee pot brewing at 5 a.m., although I'm still in bed asleep? Well, me, because I was the first cause of this chain of events. So everything's set up beforehand, but I'm still the first cause, and the secondary cause is brought about. But again, I'm the one that did it. So what he's saying is, and kind of what Seth was alluding to here, well, if you're the one that has set everything up, there's no need to intervene because you've from the front end already loaded everything that you're going to do. So there's no reason to intervene. So here he's having to imply that the quote normal effects of secondary causes are things that God has his hand off of, is allowing to happen, and then decides to intervene, which again would imply, like Seth was saying, he didn't do so in the front end.
Well, I think a good biblical example of secondary causes where the agent is still guilty for it is David and Uriah, where David ultimately sends for his troops to pull back and leave Uriah out unprotected, so he will die, so as to protect himself from being found out with regard to his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba, his wife.
That was messed up.
And so that, yeah, that's very messed up. But that's a secondary cause. I mean, it wasn't David is not the primary cause. He didn't pull the gun and shoot, or whatever. He's not the one who killed by his own hand Uriah, but he caused through secondary means the death of Uriah because it was his intention for that evil to happen. And right. So just saying something as a secondary cause doesn't seem to be sufficient enough to get God off the hook with regard to the morality here, which right. Seth, I want to bring you back here on this, because that's kind of what you bring up. If Y, secondary causes, is 100% determined by X, a primary cause, how is Y not just another name for X? The distinction is merely verbal. You're saying God overrules himself, which is nonsensical. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, so the differentiation, he comments on that to say, well, basically what you're saying is that God being sovereign makes him the immediate cause of everything, and that's not really what I'm getting at. It's not that he's the immediate cause. It's that he is the ultimate explanation for the end effect. He is the reason, but for his activity, but for his causing the secondary cause to do what it does, the secondary cause would not do what it does. So there's a distinction to be made between a man and the stick that he's using to poke something, right? They're different objects. Right. The stick, though, does not have agency. It's just an instrument of the man who's using it to poke something. So that's what I'm getting at here, is that it's what's difficult to tease apart when you get to the morality of it, like you just alluded to, is how I want to understand why we should think of morality, the culpability attaching to the secondary agent rather than the primary or first cause. And that's maybe where, Eric, you can chime in and talk about, like, what is the explanation really for how that is supposed to, because they differentiate, right? What's said normally is all of the moral responsibility for good acts by secondary agents attaches to God. All of the responsibility for evil acts attaches to men, the secondary agents, men, not the primary agent. Well, why? What is the difference, really, the qualitative difference between the causation in case of good events and evil actions? I don't understand the distinction between the two. How does God stand behind evil in such a way that he's not morally culpable for it? That is what I want to unpack and try to understand. And it's hard to get clear answers on this. Maybe, Eric, if you could speak to that a little bit on what's the differentiation between those two, if any.
Yeah, so great question. So it just revolves around a few things. The first would be how one would define free will, because when we're describing an event, when we want to know what's responsible for this event, we're always going to look for the first cause that sets everything in motion in order to bring out some final cause, end, goal, or purpose. Playing pool, I use the cue stick to hit the white ball, to hit the 8 ball in the corner pocket. So I am the first cause of this event. My end goal, or what Aristotle called the final cause, was to win the game. And the efficient or secondary causes were the balls hitting each other in order to move into that pocket. But if again, when you're looking for who's responsible for this, or quote, who's winning the game, well, it's the person that initiated it as the first cause. So as I've often argued, and
okay, now so you're saying that though. Now he's appealing to Aristotle in defense of his view. So does that work? Does that appeal to Aristotle work? Would Aristotle agree with him?
Well, not the way he's using it, because I read the article that he wrote, and no, he's not using the. There are some things lost in translation here, because he's going to appeal to Aristotle's four causes, but in reality, these aren't causes in the way we would think of as causes. They're more of four explanations or four becauses. So if you were to ask me, why is the statue heavy, I would say because, literally be and cause, it's made of marble. So I'm not saying that there's some kind of causal effect happening. Rather, it's an explanation, hence because, the explanation for which it's made of marble, and marble's heavy. So he's actually using whether intentional or not, I don't know, but it's almost a bait and switch with the word cause as Aristotle used it back then, as opposed to the way we use it now.
Right. Well, and let me jump in to say that the discussion there on Twitter, y'all go back and forth, which you can see kind of scrolling there. I won't go through all of that, because what it ends up is Seth making his case here, which is basically the case we're all trying to make with regard to how is it that Calvinists get away with believing in sovereignty as ultimately EDD, exhaustive divine determinism, and God not being the author of evil. And so he's making that case. And Seth, you ask, I think, the same question I asked when I read the article that Phil Johnson posted with regard to this, and this is what Eric is alluding to. So let me put that up on the screen. And this is, again, by Phil Johnson here. Does Calvinism make God the author of evil? Now, Seth, I asked him just earlier today if he wanted to join us, and he graciously is giving us his time here. He's got other stuff to do this afternoon. I told him just bow out when you can and when you need to. So if you see him disappear off the screen, that will be the reason. Yeah, so we'll keep you on here as long as we can. We love having you here, because I think you can kind of press on the questions here. But Phil Johnson sets this up by saying Arminians, which I guess we would be included in that camp, though obviously we wouldn't call ourselves Arminians. I think Phil Johnson would probably refer to us as Arminians regardless. So Arminians often insist that God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever come to pass, end quote, from the Westminster Confession. Then he must morally be responsible for sin. If his decree caused everything that happens, they claim, that makes him the cause of evil, and that in turn contradicts James 1:13, 1 John 1:5, and I would include about 1,000 other verses in there, but nevertheless, those are a couple. So how have Calvinists responded to this? He goes on to write this. Classic Calvinism does teach, of course, that God's eternal decree is a binding verdict that sets everything in motion towards a predetermined end. I don't think that's a very good starting sentence, because it's not very specific, because we could even say, and Molinist I know could say, that God decrees is a binding verdict that sets everything in motion with a predetermined end. I mean, if you want to say the end is the cross and Calvary and God's victory, that is a predetermined end, but it doesn't necessarily mean exhaustive divine determinism of all moral evil events, thoughts, actions, and deeds of humanity has been determined by God too.
Right.
That's in other words, it's nondescript of Calvinism's claims with regard to exhaustive divine determinism, at least the way that I see the leading philosophical scholars from their perspective defending it, at least. He goes on to say, and God remains sovereign. Of course, that's the big definition of what that word sovereign means, but God remains sovereign in the outworking of his providence. Providence speaks of his purposeful care and management of everything he created, which we would be all on board with that, obviously. The decree is eternal, meaning it was issued before the foundation of the world. It is God's own sovereign fiat, authoritative edict. The word fiat is Latin for let it be done. But he ordained the means as well as the end, which that's an often used phrase, kind of a catch-all phrase for Calvinists when asked the question about, how do you get away with determinism? And they just say, well, God ordains the ends as well as the means, which is just another restatement of determinism. It simply means God ordains the ends, which is God's victory, but he also ordains all the means to those ends, which would include every moral act of evil, thought, desire, action, and deed of every single person, the means to that end. And that's what we're contending with. So restating what we're contending with as if it's answering the question of what we're contending with is really not an argument. It's just a restatement.
I think it's all in the means, right? The means. So he's ordained the means, and the means is secondary agents, and so that's the out.
But what is meant by the ordain? So you sovereign and unchangeably decree the nature, i.e., the desires of the means, the people, so that they do what they do by necessity because of an inborn nature that they have no control over. Is that what you mean by that? Because that seems what the tulip entails, and so that's why we're calling that out. And I'm not sure what he says here actually answers that issue, as far as I can tell. He goes on to say, in other words, God is not the direct cause. He's not he is more like David in the Bathsheba incident, in the sense that he's not the direct cause of Uriah's death, but he is the first cause, I guess, or he is the final cause. I'm not sure. We can get into that in a minute with Eric, defining the difference between the causations within Aristotle's work, at least. But he goes on to say, of all of that he decreed, he by no means is a mere passive observer of unfolding events. And I don't think anybody would say that he's just a mere passive observer of unfolding events. And so this is sometimes the way in which people, when debating other people, they will set up kind of a binary false dilemma. Like it's either this extreme or this extreme. It's either
God is either in control or everything is spiraling out of control, and there's nothing he can do about anything.
Exactly. And so we're trying to go, no, we think it's probably somewhere between those two things. And so whereas the Calvinist is saying he is omnideterministic, or it's just nothing is determined at all and everything's just haywire. How about in the middle? God determines the things he wants to determine. He intervenes when he wants to intervene. He gets done what he wants to get done. No rogue molecule is going to thwart God in his plan. He's bigger than that. He can take care of rogue molecules and rogue demons, for that matter. He can take care of he's big enough to handle our mistakes and all of our problems. And so that's kind of where we land, obviously.
Amen.
Nor is he subject to any higher or more determinative will than his own. Again, we would agree with that. But let it be done is not necessarily the exact logical equivalent of I myself will do this. And of course, we would, I think, agree with that. Nobody is saying that God's choice to create a world with free creatures is the same as him saying, I will do this.
I wasn't making the argument that God is the immediate cause of everything. I don't think it's necessary to make that argument. I think, what we'll probably unpack in a little bit more detail here is it doesn't necessarily matter if you are, we've touched on this a little bit, it doesn't necessarily matter if you're the immediate cause. What matters is if you are really the only actual agent that's determining what end outcomes are in the whole process, the causal chain. I think that's what matters when you get down to moral culpability and things of that nature. But,
well, it's what John Piper refers to as decisive cause, where the word decisive is obviously the deciding factor. What is the decider when it comes to man's desires and intentions? And John Piper explicitly says man is never the decisive cause of his desires and his choices, that God is ultimately the decisive cause. And he, in other words, he is the decider. He is the determiner. So right. He is ultimately deciding what you will decide. So you are making a real decision. You are deciding something, but right. you're deciding something based upon what he has decided you will decide.
Right.
So
which is why it's not your decision to distinguish between intentions. In the Twitter dialogue where we're going back and forth, the out is usually, okay, well, the reason that when God stands behind evil, he's not responsible for it is because of his intentions in those actions. And the reason that man is responsible is because of man's intentions. So man has bad intentions, God has good intentions. But man only has bad intentions because God intended for man to have bad intentions. So that doesn't really seem like an out to me.
Right, because if you do affirm total inability, the T of tulip, total depravity, the concept is because of Adam and Eve's sin, which again, you have to decide how that came to pass as well. That's a whole other discussion. But because of Adam and Eve's sin, God decided that everyone would be born a hater of God and could not desire to accept even his offers of grace or even his appeal to be reconciled unless they were unconditionally picked before they were born and irresistibly graced and caused to believe through some irresistible or effectual means. That is just plain old determinism. You're determined by the nature you were born with. By nature, we don't believe in Mother Nature. God determined that you would be born with a nature that would only refuse God unless he changed your nature, which would certainly accept God.
Right.
That's just divine determinism. And I don't know how Calvinists get out from under the quandaries that we're presenting here by appealing to secondary causes to do that. But hopefully maybe it'll come. Maybe Aristotle will explain this all for us. And it'll all come to light. Okay, so, but isn't it still the case? He presents his interlocutor's question here. But isn't it still the case that God's decree ultimately causes whatsoever comes to pass? And Phil writes, well, yes, in one sense, but there is more than one sense of the word cause. We rightly distinguish between efficient and final causes, sometimes labeled proximate and ultimate causes. These are not concepts made up on the fly for the benefit of dodging Arminian objections. The distinctions between various kinds of causes are long established differentiations. Elementary concepts of truth and logic go back to at least as far as Aristotle. Aristotle, for example, named 4 categories of cause: the final cause, as for the sake of which something happens; the efficient cause, the agent whose action produces the effect; 3, the material cause, the substance that gives being to the effect; and then 4, the formal cause, the shape, pattern, definition, or species of the effect. And there's some more information there from the encyclopedia on philosophy. God is the final cause, not the efficient cause of evil. And this is, Eric, I guess when we want to jump in here, before I give these illustrations that Phil lays out and that I think Seth contends with, and I have a lot of contentions with as well, which, by the way, you'll love one of the illustrations that Phil chooses to use because anyway, it'll be reminiscent of critiques from James White and my analogesis, and here to come. So, but before we do that, do you want to talk a little bit about Aristotle's 4 causes, Eric, and give us a little bit of history there, or a little background with regard to philosophy on these issues?
Yeah, like I said, the way we could understand them is more as 4 explanations or 4 becauses, not really causes in the sense that he's trying to make. And this is where I think a lot of the confusion comes in. Like, for example, when he talks about efficient causes don't necessarily have to be agents, as I explained using the pull analogy. What Aristotle was trying to do first and foremost was trying to get at how do we have knowledge of something? How can we exhaustively know anything that we're looking at? So he says, well, if you're going to explain something, which in his mind would mean if you can explain it, then you have knowledge of it, then you need to explain at least 4 things. The purpose, which would be the final cause; the efficient, the way in which it was brought about; the material, the stuff it's made of; and then the formal, the idea or pattern that is in mind when something is brought into existence. So for Phil to call God a final cause really misunderstands the notion of what it means to be a final cause. The final cause is an end product or purpose. When I make a table to eat on, the to eating on aspect is the end purpose of the table. So how can God be an end purpose? It doesn't even make sense. So again, he's starting off on the wrong foot. But what's telling is that he settles the entire issue in that red part you read earlier, where he says, but isn't it still the case that God's decree ultimately causes whatsoever comes to pass? Here he's using causes the way we're using them here, and you can replace the word ultimately with first. And isn't it still the case that God's decree is the first cause of whatever comes to pass? And he says, yes, in some sense. If in any sense God is the first cause, then that's where you find the culpability or responsibility of any action taking place.
So, that's my point, yeah.
Yes. So he says yes. And if that's the case, well, then there's really no reason to read further, especially not the way he misuses these causes that Aristotle's given us.
Right.
And I think this will really come to light. It'll be really easy to understand for those of you who are like me, who are drooling on your keyboard, trying to figure out everything that the philosophers are talking about. When illustrations come in, people wonder why I use illustrations. It's because you have to dumb things down for me to help me figure them out. And Eric's really good at this. He sometimes he'll drop by my office, and I'll say, explain this to me, and he'll give me an illustration. And I'll say, okay, I got it. Thanks for talking at my level. I appreciate that. But the reason I use analogies and stories is because I can get it. I follow the analogies. And so I'm really appreciative of the fact that Phil gives us some analogies, some ways to understand this on a human level. Now, before I read these analogies, let me say, he does say these are not perfect examples. And I don't want to over nitpick his examples, but they're not only imperfect examples, I don't think they're analogous examples, given the fact of what he believes about a sovereign God, because he says these are not perfect examples because there's no exact parallel to a sovereign God, because a sovereign God for Calvinist is a deterministic God. And so, yeah, these aren't perfect examples because they're not even hitting on the point of contention with regard to your assumption that God is deterministically sovereign.
Right.
And so the one analogy I'm going to focus on is the number 3 one, because anytime you jump analogies, you end up getting more confusing. And time's sake here, I'm just going to use the third analogy because that's the one Seth focused on. It also happens to be the one that I use in my book and in my debate and other places where James White rails on me using analogies and mocks me for using this analogy. And Phil Johnson, one of his friends, actually used it probably before I did. I'm guessing he probably wrote this article before I ever used it. I didn't get it from him, but the sting operation of a police officer is the analogy, okay? So he writes this analogy. A car thief caught in a sting operation makes the futile plea that he is not guilty because he would never have stolen the car if the police had not left it unlocked with the keys in the ignition. Here, the cops are absolutely the final cause because they staged the opportunity for the crime in order to catch the ring of serial car thieves operating in the neighborhood. The thief himself is the efficient cause. He is also the only person in this scenario with the evil intent. Now, let me read what Phil says before we jump on this, because I know people listening are wanting to jump in on this really quickly because it's pretty obvious the problem here. He says it's imperfect, obviously, as we've already pointed out, to show how somebody can cause an evil action. These are just examples to show how someone can cause an evil action that he or she is not morally culpable for, which we would agree with, because like I said, I've used a sting operation to demonstrate this. In examples 2 and 3, the perpetrator wants to transfer the blame from himself to the efficient cause to someone else. The robber wants to blame the cops for what they did, the final cause in each case. This is what, look what he says. This is what those provisionists, this is what Leighton Flowers and those Arminians typically try to do with God, pinning the moral responsibility for all evil on him as the final cause, but the blame for any evil thing lies first and foremost with that criminal, that efficient cause, that guy who stole the car. Before I jump in on this, because man, I am reared up and ready to go. Seth, why don't you take it first and ask your questions?
For this analogy to work, and what he's trying to expose here is a flaw in our thinking. I think it undercuts his argument completely. I mean, in this case, I would never, I wouldn't say that the cops are responsible for this thief in this case. And here you have. The cops don't know what the thief is going to do. They've set up a scenario. The thief comes in and exercises his free will and does the wrong thing, and so they pounce on him. Now you can try to make an argument about whether sting operations like this are moral. You're setting somebody up. Maybe you do have some culpability there. You could try to make that argument, I guess. But the point here is that the cops are not to blame for the decision that the thief himself makes. They did not give him his evil intent. And the reason this is not an analogy to Calvinism's divine determinism is because on Calvinism's divine determinism, the evil intent comes from God. That is why the thief has that intent. And if you go backwards, before this all played out, every decision and every event that happened in the thief's life to turn him into a thief and make him have these intentions and these motives and to be in this scenario was also planned out by God. So it ultimately fails as an analogy to show that somehow this would be a situation where the cause, the culpability doesn't go back to this cause, that it's removed. Clearly, I think God's relationship to thieves in the real world is very different from the cops' relationship to thieves in this analogy.
Right. And the reason I've used the sting analogy is for this very reason, to say that a thief or a robber or drug dealer, whatever it is, is in that condition by his own choosing, which is true of this analogy. He's libertarianly freely a thief. He didn't have to be a thief.
Right.
And by leaving the car with the keys in it in his sight, the cops aren't causing that to happen. They're influencing him. There could have been 3 other thieves that walked by and ignored the car for whatever reason. There could have been some people who don't have bad character, who aren't car thieves, who walked by the car. So in other words, leaving the car there is not the causal determination of what caused the thief to do this. The thief is the one who made that decision based upon his character. And his character was developed by his own choices over time. And that's the whole point of it, is that a cop, just like Jesus did in the time of Pilate and Judas, God doesn't cause Pilate and Judas to have bad character and to be money hungry or to be prideful. He knows them and uses them in their time to bring about his good purpose through them. Just like the cops here aren't causing the thieves to be thieves. And what do we mean by causing the thief to be thief? Well, that's what total inability is. Total inability is this thing that I was born in this condition of being a thief by a divine decree that I had no control over. In the same way, on Calvinism, we are all born God haters who hate the gospel and reject everything that God brings to us. And we are blind spiritually to all things that are spiritually made known to us. And yet we are still culpable for that which we're blind to and that which we cannot respond positively to on the claims of Calvinism. And so this whole analogy is resting upon the fact that the thief is a thief by his own choosing, not by the cops choosing, not by the cops determination. And that's where this analogy falls apart, because it undermines.
Well, and the reason that he doesn't offer, I would say the reason he doesn't offer an analogy that actually works for this scenario is because there is no analogy you can come up with that would, where you would be able to say, there is no analogy you could come up with that would be actually an analogy for divine determinism that wouldn't make it seem like the first cause, that set the whole thing in motion and determined what the agent would do and all of that wouldn't be culpable. When you start thinking of those analogies, which there are plenty of examples of, you could kind of tweak these analogies to make them actually analogous to divine determinism, and then all of a sudden you'll see culpability. So he's either cherry picked. I guess he's either cherry picking here to try to show analogies that will work for him. But you're not going to find something in the real world. There's not going to be a real world example of the kind of deterministic working out of events here where you're going to be able to say that they're not responsible. The cops aren't responsible here for obvious reasons. And I think if the cops were, I said this in one of my tweets. I said, cops never render crime certain by acting as determinative agents who control criminals and cause them as secondary agents or instruments to commit the crimes the police department wanted them to commit. If they did act in that way, they'd be criminally liable and, yes, evil.
Yeah, well said. JJ Phillips says of you, Eric Hernandez is thinking of a syllogism right now. I can see it. Eric, what do you want to say to this so far?
Well, a few things. Well, one, this is because, again, he is using the efficient and final not in traditional ways, and this is what happens when you learn just enough philosophy to get yourself in trouble and to make mistakes like this. But one thing that popped out to me just not too long ago was that here's the funny thing. Let's use his analogy and see if this applies to something he would disagree with. In his mind, the cops are, I'm going to use the word first cause because that's really what he means, not final cause. The cops are the final cause. The first cause. See, now he's got me doing it. The cops are the first cause of the criminal stealing. Why? Because what Phil's arguing is that they left the door unlocked, which gave the opportunity, which as he says, for the crime to take place. Now, okay, apply this to opportunity being the key word there. So go ahead. Exactly. Now let's take that, and then now let's look at God. By creating me, did God give me the opportunity to sin? Yes. Well, by the same line of logic, then much like the cops, according to Phil, are responsible for the crime because they gave the opportunity for the crime to be committed, then in the same sense, God is responsible. In other words, it turns it on his head and works back again. It backfires. Then now God is responsible for any evil I do because much like leaving the car unlocked, he's left my actions unlocked, if you will, and I have the opportunity to sin. So if we're going to use this analogy, then we can apply it to God. But again, he's going to reject that. So if it doesn't apply there, then it shouldn't apply here either.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and if that's all that's entailed, then in what God has done, then what is he allowing the opportunity for, if not the free will choice of the criminal, if not the free will choice of the agent? What does opportunity even mean? Just like intervention that Seth points out. What kind of vocabulary does that even, how are we supposed to rationally understand that kind of vocabulary in a deterministic worldview? And that's what
on Calvinism, does God merely create the opportunity for criminals to commit crime? Is that fair language to use on Calvinism? Is he creating an opportunity by giving them freedom in the world? But you know, they would deny that he has genuine libertarian freedom. So I don't know in what sense that's an opportunity. You know, the analogy is presenting us with what seems like an example of a libertarian free choice.
Right. Which is, anytime you hear a Calvinist saying God allowed something, or he restrained something, or he intervened, you seem to be insinuating, if nothing else, that there's a libertarian free will in which he must restrain. So otherwise, he's restraining something he's decreed to happen. So he decrees the king to want to rape the woman in one situation, one of the verses that was raised by John Piper in one of the discussions, but God thwarts him from doing it. He uses this as an example of sovereignty. See, the king wanted to rape the woman, but God stopped him from doing it, and he says that proves sovereignty from his perspective. Okay, so why did he want to rape the woman in the first place? Doesn't all things mean all things when it comes to the divine decree? Doesn't he decree for the man to want to rape the woman, and then step in to thwart the man from being able to carry out what you decreed for him to want to do? In other words, the intentions of the king are as much within the sovereign plan and decree of God as is his thwarting of the king. On your perspective, you have to leave room for man's intentions being autonomous of them, not of God, not of a divine decree, if you may want to make sense of any of this stuff. And that's what the Calvinist doesn't seem to want to do, or at least most of them don't seem to want to do it in a clear enough way for us to rationally follow what they're saying, at least. That maybe the nicest way I know how to put it. So there's other examples. The example just before that is another good one to kind of point out what we're saying. He says, my enemy, in a fit of rage over something I have done or said, goes on a wanton spree of vandalism. Okay? And so there's a person in a fit of rage because of something you've done or said, and he goes on a wanton spree of vandalism. Now, could he have gone and hit on his punching bag in his garage instead of going and vandalizing the world? Couldn't he have handled his anger towards what you did in some other way besides vandalizing the streets? I don't see why not. Surely he could have done that. So if his enemy chooses to vandalize in a fit of rage over something that you and I we do, then that's still his fault. He's the cause. The vandal is the cause of the vandalism, not the person he's reacting to. He goes on to say, he is arrested, tried, and found guilty because he is the efficient cause. Yet he continues to blame me for the episode. Indeed, I am the final cause, he says, for he did this because of me, but I am not morally culpable. Of course, you're not morally culpable because you are not the decisive or the determinative cause of him using vandalism as his mode of expressing his frustration and pain. You want to add to that?
Who thinks these analogies fit? I don't know why. I don't know why anyone thinks these analogies fit.
Yeah, not only
really good question.
Not only do the analogies not fit, again, the language doesn't fit, and I think here's a clear example. So when he says he is the efficient cause, you can ask the efficient cause of what? Well, he's the efficient cause of vandalism. Now, again, a final cause is the purpose to bring something about. An efficient cause brings about the purpose or goal, which is a final cause. So if we're going to take the terminology, then what he's saying is that this person causing vandalism is the efficient cause, and if I'm the final cause, then technically he's saying that the criminal here is the efficient cause of bringing about my purpose. That doesn't even make sense. how can I be the final cause of vandalism? Again, the final cause is the end result of something. So the efficient cause is going to point to bringing about the final cause. So in no way, it doesn't even make sense to say I'm the final cause. Well, how did I come about? By his vandalism. Doesn't even make sense. So not only is it a bad analogy, it doesn't apply.
Well, yeah, it almost sounds like you, for whatever you said, you actually wanted him to do vandalism, that you actually planned for him to do vandalism, that you actually not only planned and wanted him to do vandalism, but that somehow you made his character such that he would only and could only choose to do vandalism given the situations of what you did and said in his presence that set him off, so to speak. And and this gets to the point of the difference between causation and what we might say influence. For example, if somebody said, well, Leighton, why did you eat the piece of cake? I could say, well, because cake tastes so good. Well, does that mean the taste of cake caused me, determined for me to eat it? Or does it mean that I chose to fulfill that desire on the basis of the taste of cake, and that I am the determiner, I am the determiner of my determinations, I am the cause of my choices. The actor is the cause of his actions. Not that the taste of cake somehow causally determined me to eat it, but that it influenced me, and that I acted upon that desire when I could have refrained from acting upon that desire. Now, I would love to be able to say I have no control over the choices of my meals each day, because then I could tell my wife that at the end of the night when she's holding me accountable for the things I ate. But unfortunately, it doesn't work with her or with God, I don't think. Eric, explain to us the difference between influences and causes. And it seems to me that he almost seems to suggest that the cops, by giving an opportunity to steal a car, by that influence, sometimes that somehow means that is a necessity, therefore, for the criminal to act upon that opportunity or that influence.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, it goes back to the definition of free will, especially when we're talking about intent and responsibility. So I would define free will, as I have in the past, as if you're the first cause of your will or actions, you have free will, which is to say nothing external or prior to you is causing something to come about. So what also makes it more complicated is that there's oftentimes more than one. There's many factors involved in something, and what tends to get confused, like you're rightly pointing out, is an influence and a cause. So if I'm the first mover and I have libertarian free will, then I'm perfectly fine with conceding that there are many things that influence my decisions, but as a first mover, I must still to choose whether or not I act or refrain from acting upon my influences. Because if an influence is a cause, well, then it doesn't make sense to call it an influence. It's a cause. That's why I often like to ask the question to the determinists, is an influence an influence, or is an influence a cause? Because if it's a cause, then don't call it an influence. If it's an influence, you can't call it a cause. I can even go a step further and concede I have no problem saying there are many things that are determined about me, but again, that doesn't determine my actions. That's jumping categories. So for example, I may have a taste for a particular food because of what my mother ate when she was pregnant with me. So I have deterministic influences about what I like to eat and the taste that I prefer. But again, these are determined influences, not determined causes. So if I'm trying to lose weight, then I can resist the determined influence of what I like to eat and yet still choose to refrain from acting upon these influences. So it's either an influence or a cause, and conflating the two is where you get into these kind of messes.
What do you say to people like R.C. Sproul, who say we always act in accordance with our greatest desire at any moment of choice?
Yeah, I would say I don't. Now, of course, it begs the question, and then I think it's also circular reasoning. It's nothing you couldn't prove it by pointing to something, because again, you would be begging the question. I think the only person that can answer this question is each person individually, because there is no way you can step into my mind and see that. But this all goes back to, just look at how this affects spiritual formation and discipleship. When on the Sermon on the Mount, like I've pointed out before, Jesus is making a really interesting point where he's changing the whole ball game. In brief, he's talking about adultery. He's saying, basically saying, it's not enough to just not commit an action. You have to change your desires, which means he's putting the responsibility of what you desire on these people. So he says,
Yeah.
okay, so who here has refrained from committing adultery? Pat yourself on the back. But have you thought about it? Which means the responsibility is more on the desire and the intent as opposed to the action. Which means Christ
Yeah.
is implicitly admitting here that we are responsible for our desires. Well, if that's the case, then it would make no sense to say that our desires cause something, because then it moves the responsibility from that to desires. But again, if we aren't responsible for our desires, but their cause, then it goes into the whole deterministic ball of wax that we're getting into here.
Yeah, good points. I want to bring Seth back in here too. He
I've
pretty
got like
much
2
makes the
minutes
argument.
and I got to run.
Okay.
So,
Well, feel free just to drop out when you can here. But here on Twitter, you make the point: cops never render crimes certain by acting as determinative agents who control criminals and cause them as secondary agents or instruments to commit the crimes the police department wants them to commit. If they did act in that way, they'd be criminally liable and, yes, evil. And then Phil responds, and he says, God works all things according, which all things I would assume means all desires of all intentions of all criminals and sinners for that matter. God works all things according to the counsel of his will, Ephesians 1:11. But although under his sovereign rule, evil agents act with evil intentions, God's intention is always for good. God's light, and in him there's no darkness. And so he seems to be saying evil agents act with evil intentions, as if the evil intentions aren't included in the all things that are according to God's divine decree.
well, I asked about that. I said this raises an obvious question: where do human intentions come from? And I made the statement. I answered my own question. I said on Calvinism they trace back to God. He replied to that with a puzzling response. He said, "No, Calvin expressly says otherwise. I thought you said you read my article." So he's talking out both sides of his mouth. On the one hand, he's saying, everything is ordained by God and comes from God and is caused by God. And on the other hand, he's taking back and speaking out the other side of his mouth and saying that
what you do, unlike him, is you actually quote a Calvinist scholar, Helm. God ordains evil, but does not intend evil as a human agent intends it. Mm-hmm. And are the intentions of men included in all things when the Westminster says God ordains or decrees all things that come to pass? Either yes or no.
Well, I think you can quote dozens of Calvinists saying yes. I mean, they'll say that it's every thought and motive. Isn't that Edwards' language? Motives.
Yes.
Come from God. Yes. Right.
Absolutely.
So you won't have a hard time finding Calvinists who affirm that. He's saying that Calvin denies that. I hear Calvinists all the time say, "Well, Calvinism isn't just what Calvin said." Sometimes he's not representative of what Reformed theologians believe today. I'm not sure what he's getting at there with that. Maybe you guys can speak to that, what he's talking about with Calvin expressly saying otherwise on that. But if Calvin denies the human intentions come from God, are they self-originated? And doesn't that just obliterate this whole idea of sovereignty?
I certainly think so, and I think that's part of the problem. And Seth, I know you need to bow out.
Yeah, so I got to run, guys. Thanks so much for having me on for this discussion. I will catch up on the rest of it and watch it later.
Thanks, brother. We'll talk to you again soon. God bless.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Well, I replied to that one on from the tweet when I actually quote from his own boss. That's always fun to do. I quote from John MacArthur, and I write, God is John MacArthur wrote on gracetoyou.org, which is his ministry, by the way, Phil Johnson's ministry that he's the director of. God is certainly sovereign over evil. There is a sense in which it is proper to say that evil is a part of his eternal decree. He planned for it. It did not take him by surprise. And we would agree, if that's what you mean, that God is not surprised by evil and that he in his eternal decree planned for evil men making evil choices and that he can bring about his purposes despite that. I'm fine with that vocabulary. Now, maybe he has a different dictionary than I would behind those words, but the words themselves are fine with me. It is not an interruption of his eternal plan. He declared the end from the beginning and is still working all things for his good pleasure. But God's role with regard to evil is never as its author. He simply permits evil agents to work and then overrules evil for his own wise and holy ends. Ultimately, he is able to make all things, including all the fruits of all evil of all time, work together for a greater good. I say amen. That's exactly, I think, a parallel to Ephesians 1:11, which he just quoted as a proof text for his view, is to say God's not causing or determining or decreeing evil agents to work the way they do for his purposes. He is overriding and bringing about and redeeming the evil choices of agents. There's a huge difference between determining agents to do evil for your purposes versus overruling, overriding people you have permitted to make free choices that can bring about your purpose through even their evil choices. There's a big difference between that. Do you want to comment on that, Eric? I don't mean to just diatribe here, but I just wanted to give you some time for feedback too.
Commenting on what you read earlier in that tweet, what he may be referring to about, Calvin said otherwise, he may be referring, what sometimes determinists do is a punt, which is really just putting back the goalposts and say, well, it comes from the person's nature, but then you would just have to ask the question, well, where does that nature come from? So in other words, ironically, he's pointing to efficient causes in order to try to avoid, God as a first cause. But again, once you go back to the first cause, that's where you will find the culpability, whatever that first cause is, whether it's still in the car, whether it's making coffee, playing pool, whatever the case. So you can't just point to an efficient cause and say, well, no, that's responsible for it, because if it's the efficient, well, then we haven't gotten to the beginning of the chain. That's where we want to get to, and that's what's going to give us the agent responsible.
Well said. Now, do you want to cover any more of the article that Phil posted? Was there something else in here? I know we only touched on the first portion of it here, but he does get into secondary causes and other things. Is there something else that you wanted to highlight that might be helpful to our audience with regard to what maybe Phil is trying to illustrate here?
Not in particular. I mean, because really, like I said, the problem is that he's not using it accurately, and he's even confusing some things or conflating two types of definitions of the word cause. And anything else would get deeper, because we're talking about events, and like with the bank robbery analogy, the final cause of this friend, a person robs a bank to help pay medical bills, but there's two events going on here: paying medical bills and robbing a bank. The final cause, the purpose for robbing the bank, is to obtain money. Once you've reached the final cause, it now becomes a different event. So he's robbed the bank. Why? That's the efficient cause. Why? To get money. Okay. Now the next event is pay medical bills, because robbing a bank doesn't equal paying medical bills. No, that's already been accomplished. Now you pay medical bills. What's the efficient cause? Well, you write a check to the hospital that it's for. So again, he's confusing terminology. He's not using it in the right way, and then he's trying to mix together two different events that have two different final causes. So, I mean, in essence, he's not using it the way it should be used, and that's, like I said, is what creates the confusion.
Okay, he does get to the concept of bare permission, where he talks about Calvin's dismissal of those who use the term permission, but he tries to make the distinction between bare permission and what he would call, I guess, true divine permission. I don't know. I don't know what it is God's permitting on his perspective, except what he's decreed. I guess he's permitting what he has decreed to happen. So I decree the person to want to do this, and then I permit them to do this thing that I've decreed them to want to do. I don't know what distinction he's trying to draw here with regard to bare permission in the Arminian sense. In other words, what is bare permission in the Arminian sense versus permission in the Calvinistic sense? If it's compatibilistic permission, then it's a person is free to do what they want to do, but their wants are ultimately within God's sovereign decree. In other words, God decrees your nature, your desires, to be what they are, and they could not have been or would not have ever been otherwise based upon what he's decreed for them to do. And this is not God knowing what they will do beforehand and permitting it or allowing it. This is God determining it to be that way by his divine decree. And so if not bare permission in the Arminian sense, then what is permission in the Calvinistic sense? Do you have an idea of what that means, at least from Phil's perspective?
No, not. I really don't, because like you said, I've said a lot similar before in the past. It's basically with compatibilism, you're free to do whatever it is you were determined to do in the first place, which kind of is a play on words it's a contradiction in terms, basically.
And I think some of the philosophical problems is the conflating of certainty with necessity, as he even does here. As I think William Lane Craig is famous for, at least famous on here, for helping us to understand the modal fallacy of conflating certainty with necessity, that something can be known certainly in the mind of the creator without being necessitated by the creator himself. And that is mysterious in that we don't know a source of God's knowledge, just like we don't know the source of his power. There's a lot of things we don't know how God does what he does. We don't know how God creates something from nothing. I don't know how God knows something that I'm going to do tomorrow. I just believe that he does based upon the faith of divine revelation that he tells me he does. And so I don't need to explain philosophically necessarily how God knows what he knows, any more so than I have to explain how he created something from nothing. But what the Calvinist seems to be doing is stepping in and saying, no, we know how he knows what you're going to do tomorrow. He determined it. He decreed it. And that's how he knows. And we're just going, chapter, verse, where does the Bible say that God determined, in that sense of the word, your quote unquote desires, nature, negative intentions to be such that you could not choose to do other than what you choose to do? And that, I guess, that becomes the philosophical quandary that Boethius and many others have tried to tackle over the course of human history, right?
Yeah, and even then, I'm wondering what Augustine's literal words were, and it may have been necessity, but of course, he wasn't speaking English. But in philosophy, something that is necessary means it's impossible that something's not going to happen. But it wouldn't make sense to say, in other words, God could have refrained from creating Adam and Eve or any other creature in the first place. Well, if he could have done that, then it no longer becomes a case that the fall was necessary, given that there wouldn't be any people. So when you start using these technical terms, that's why I said earlier, some people know just enough philosophy to kind of get in trouble. And maybe I get myself in trouble sometimes, I don't know. But it's when you're using that word in philosophy, it means something specific. It means it was literally impossible for this not to happen, which makes everything within that event necessary, which means now Adam and Eve are necessary because that event is necessary. But again, the only thing necessary would be God, and everything else is contingent. And that includes every event and action that takes place. So every action that's ever happened was contingent, not necessary.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it, to see that God is the only necessary being, in that you and I aren't necessary. In other words, God doesn't need us to exist. We're not necessary to exist. Now, we need him to exist. And some people equate that with a concept, an idea that we can't be autonomous creatures. And when we're speaking of autonomy, we're not talking about we exist autonomously from God, obviously. But when we talk about autonomous will, what we're saying is that we will autonomous from the will of God. In other words, we're not willing what he wills us to will. His will wasn't that he decides what choices we make, but that we're free to make our own choices. That is his will. So when we make a choice, whether for good or evil, we're not countervailing the sovereign will of God, because he didn't decide which choices we would make. He decided that we would be free to make choices, and that we would live with the consequences of those choices. And that seems intuitive. That seems pretty basic. And I think determinism is that overarching philosophy that clouds these issues. And I understand the tendency to be drawn into a kind of a deterministic philosophy. I mean, most atheists are determinists in the sense of material world, materialistic determinists. And it seems to me within Christianity, there's that tendency to want to try to explain everything. And so we have to know what causes everything. And if I have to have a cause, then who am I going to give that cause to if I'm a theist? Well, I'm going to put all the cause back onto God. And God must be the cause of this choice or this choice or this choice. And the fact of the matter is, I believe God is big enough to have created beings who are first cause agents. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, not that we're creating ourselves, but that we are creating our own decisions. We're decision-making beings. We can make choices for ourselves for which we're morally accountable. is there philosophically, I mean, theologically, obviously that's all about human responsibility. Philosophically, what are the issues that are raised with the concept of true libertarian free will, autonomous choices, for example, that are often brought by the Calvinist or the determinist in these kinds of arguments?
Well, yeah, and going back to even what you said, this is where, again, some more conflation happens with, there's a difference between being the cause of something existing and then being the cause of something's capacity or ability to do something after it exists. So I've even heard some Calvinists say if libertarian free will exists, then it goes against God's divine aseity, that he is the only necessary being. But again, we're not, like you said, we're not the cause of ourselves existing. We're the cause of our actions existing. I think it was Norman Geisler who said, God is responsible for the fact of freedom, but human beings are responsible for their acts of freedom. So, how could you rephrase a question about what kind of problems would this bring up? You mean what kind of problems does free will bring up for God or for ourselves, or what?
Well, either one. I mean, philosophically, obviously, people have issues with the concept of libertarian freedom of choice, many arguing that it's irrational or that it can't exist. How do you tend to respond to people who try to make the case that libertarian freedom is irrational or illogical or couldn't exist?
Yeah, well, I mean, I had asked them to prove that that's the case. And then I always I think one of the clearest ways to do it is to point out the irony in this. So I remember one time I was talking to an atheist at this Christmas party I was invited to, and he said one of the things that moved him away from, he said he used to be a Christian, was that as he began to study, he realized that we didn't have free will and we didn't choose to be Christians in the first place. And then so I said, so you're telling me on the basis of your intellectual integrity and rational responsibility, you came to this conclusion? He said, yes. I said, okay, well, if you don't believe in free will, then did you freely come to this conclusion? And that kind of stopped him in his tracks, as if he never thought about it before. The irony of trying to make a, quote, logically consistent case and show that it is illogical to believe in free will assumes that a person has the ability to freely convince me of something other than what I am causally determined to believe in the first place. So I think that alone, it becomes just counterintuitive to what we take to be true. And when the Bible says that we're made in God's image, I would argue that part of that means that we are creatures that have the ability to be first causes with respect to our will, just like God is. A rock, a plant, those kind of things, they don't have that ability to be first movers in that sense, but we do. And I think, again, that's what it means to be made in the image of God. There are no explicit problems with having libertarian free will, because any problems, again, with air quotes, that would arise, like you said, God's big enough to handle. And as Molina said, he said, well, which God would be more sovereign? A God who can bring about his will by causing the actions of free creatures, or a God who can bring about his will through the actions of free creatures? Obviously the latter. So if anything, this magnifies, as we've often said, God's sovereignty, not limits it. Without trying to psychoanalyze anybody, I don't see any rational reasons. I can see emotional, perhaps, reasons why someone would want to deny free will, but I don't see any rational reasons why.
Isn't it true that if you can establish free will even within God, that at least you can establish it as a rational concept? So if we can at least get the Calvinists to agree with us that God could have done otherwise. In other words, God didn't have to create you. He didn't have to save you. Most Calvinists would be real quick to say, no, God didn't have to save me. There was nothing necessitating him to save me. He could have chosen otherwise. Well, they've established God has libertarian free will when they've done that, right?
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing too, is going back to the word necessary. If it wasn't necessary that God save me, well, then when he decrees that I am saved, then you can't say, well, okay, well, then now it's necessary that he save me. No, because necessity is something that's going to apply. It's going to be necessary in any possible situation. But if my salvation isn't necessary, well, then it's not necessary that I'm saved. this goes back to what you were saying, certainty and necessity. If God decrees to save me, it'll be certain, but that isn't somehow magically because God said it, make it necessary in that philosophical sense. If it's not necessary, I'm saved, well then God adding a decree to it doesn't make it necessary, but it does make it certain. And again, not necessary in that sense to where, well, nothing else could have happened. Obviously, it was God's choice, and I am saved, and it's a contingent thing I'm saved because, again, there's nothing necessary about my salvation. Whether I exist or not, God's still who he is. God is still sovereign. He still has everything at his fingertips, and I add nothing to God's existence, power, or sovereignty.
Well said. On the side chat, there's always things going back and forth, and usually I ignore the side chat when I'm trying to stay focused on the discussion. But Derek always does a good job kind of engaging with our Calvinistic interlocutors, and he calls one in to task. He says, if you think libertarian free will is the ability to do anything, please stop arguing against libertarian free will because you simply don't understand what it teaches, plain and simple. Absolutely. And this is one of the issues that I run into so often on social media, is that people think they understand a concept and it's clear they don't, because obviously any scholar worth his salt who is arguing in favor of libertarian, especially source libertarian free will, is not attempting to say that mankind can do absolutely anything. Nor are they even saying, ironically enough, that we can do something other than what God knows we will do. That's the biggest argument I'll hear is, oh, you believe God knows you'll do something tomorrow, but you could do other than what God knows you will do. No, I didn't say we could do other than what God knows you'll do. I said you could choose other than what you choose. And if you did, God would know otherwise. So there's a big difference between those concepts. And that's where I think some people not wanting to think deeper than the surface level of the conversation, just want to stop right there. And if they can prove somehow that God knows what you'll do tomorrow, then somehow that's necessary that you'll do that tomorrow. And the only way their brains can fathom that God knows you'll do that tomorrow, the how question, is because God had to determine for you to do it tomorrow, because how else would he know it? Thus proving the very point that I'm saying before. God can't know something unless he determines it on Calvinism. I believe God can know things he doesn't determine. And so our view of God, again, is higher. His omniscience is actually omniscience, not just omnideterminism. What do you say to that?
Yeah, and it also seems, and depending on how the person hashes it out, it's dangerously close to saying that God's omniscience is dependent upon something. We would argue that God is omniscient necessarily, inherently. Kind of goes back to, because I say, well, how can God know it? Is like saying, well, how did God become all powerful? How many sets does he do? What kind of creatine does it take? Well, that assumes there's a means by which he obtains this. Well, the same thing with omniscience. If God is only omniscient because he causes something, well, then now you need some kind of philosophical creatine, if you will, in order for him to gain that omniscience. So again, it gets dangerously close to that. And the other thing you were saying was with respect to, what was it? I lost my train of thought.
Don't ask me. Don't ask me. I've been reading the side chat. I don't even remember what I was talking about 2 seconds ago after I start reading the side chat.
I was about to read that.
Yeah,
Someone mentioned my name, and I was about to say thank you, and I didn't get a chance to read it. And then when I saw you take it off, it threw me off.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Well, Derek was asking me to make sure he told the interlocutor that he was engaging with Eric that he loved him still. So, which I appreciate the kind banter, even though there's strong words on the side. There's still the brotherly love, the brotherly and sisterly love that can go along with it. But on that note, I do want to go ahead and honor your time as well this afternoon, Eric. I appreciate all that you do with Texas Baptist as well as apologetics state and nationwide, obviously. And if you are looking for training in apologetics, that's what we do at Texas Baptist, that evangelism and apologetics. And so go to texasapologetics.org or texasbaptist.org /evangelism if you want to know more information about what we do when we're not here at Sociology 101. Eric also has broadcasts that he puts out and travels and speaks to different churches, as do I. And so if you have a request for that, contact us there, and we'd be glad to come help you, especially if you're in Texas, one of our Texas Baptist churches. We'd love to have you guys. And so, as we like to say there at the convention, go now and share Christ, show love. God bless. Bye-bye.